cannot, human beings or jinn, if you were to come together to produce their like of. Even if you came together, you cannot produce this book. And the Qur'an challenges, if you think this Qur'an is not from God, that we have revealed to our servant Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, produce a chapter like it. If you really are truthful, seek helpers other than God to do this job. But the Qur'an continues saying, you will never be able to do it, even if you try. You will never be able to do it. Then fear the fire whose fuel is man and stones. So the Qur'an claims with a challenge.
Put a mic on you.
Sorry. Hope you don't mind.
What about putting some mic on the gentleman over there, Stephen?
I think they just want to hear what you're saying.
No, because the microphones are good enough, right, to capture both sounds.
There you go. There you go, Steve.
There you go, Stephen. Yeah.
Okay. Just I'll go ahead.
Can I just want to see your side?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'll just put this in
Put it in your pocket.
In the back pocket?
Yep.
I'll just put it in this pocket.
So, Stephen,
Yeah.
we were saying the Quran brings a challenge to mankind. If mankind, or anyone else besides mankind, if they're able to, if they're doubting the origin of the Quran, then what they have to do simply to falsify it. And the falsification test is quite simple. That you produce a book like it. If you're not able to produce a book like it, consisting of 114 chapters, you produce 10 chapters like it. Even if you can't do 10 chapters, produce one chapter like it. Even a one statement like this, statement like the Quran. So what is it that is objective about this challenge? Many people often misunderstand this challenge in saying it's very subjective. But the Quran is very objective in the way it challenges people. Because it says bring something like it, like the Quran. And how is the Quran? We can see the Quran is unlike other literature of the time. That's how we can understand the likeness of the Quran that you're supposed to bring. So you had the pre-Islamic literature. Before Islam came with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you had the pre-Islamic poets and orators, soothsayers with their literature. Yeah? They had a specific form of speech and poetry. You had the speech of the Prophet himself, his style of speech, and his people who were Muslims when they become Muslims, or even haven't become Muslims. So you have like three different sources: pre-Islamic literature, the Quran, and the prophetic speeches of the prophets and his companions and the people along with him, whether they're believers or unbelievers. If you compare these three genres, you will see the Quran is absolutely unique in its delivery. How is it unique? It comes up with a form which is unlike the forms that they are. For example, just to show you how unique they are, poetry had specific rhymes and meters in the pre-Islamic times. They have categorized these in about 14 bihar or seas, we call it. There are specific rhyme and specific meters. If you're going to make a poetry, you have to fulfill within this categories. Of course, now we have free form, right? Free form poetry. It doesn't have to rhyme. It doesn't have to have a meter. At that time, it was totally within these boundaries. And they were described like rajas, al-tawil, al-khafif, al-madid, various types where they fit in. The Quran came and it was none of them, neither of these types. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't prose, but it had its own rhymes and it was own meters. That's what the challenge is, bring something like the Quran. So the constructions of the way the Quran presents its ayat very roughly translates as verses. It is totally unique. One ayah or a verse of the Quran could be just one word or could be a whole paragraph. Totally unique. The way it starts, the constructions, it brings a linguistic convention, and it asks people to match something like it. So if you're going to match something like it,
I don't think it does.
It does what, sorry?
I don't think what you're saying is true. I don't think it does. I think that's what you're just trying to generate.
What I'm saying, the Quran says, if you are doubtful that this is not a revelation from God, then produce a chapter like the Quran. A chapter of the Quran, one of the smallest chapters, 3-4 lines or 3-4 ayat. 3-4 ayat. the way they are constructed is what we're talking about. So we can objectively measure. In fact,
But it was only, remember, the Qur'an was written a few hundred years after the fact, wasn't it?
After who?
It was a few hundred years after the life of Muhammad.
and what makes you say that?
That's I think everybody knows that.
And not everybody knows that. In fact, everybody doesn't know that at all. We have manuscripts of the Qur'an dating from the companions' time, his companions. We're talking about within, few years of his lifetime.
Yes, and they were all put together a couple of hundred years after the fact.
Let's understand one thing. We have manuscripts of the Qur'an that dates within the 1st century of Islam.
Yes.
So the claim that it was put together 200-300 years later is a claim which is historically false.
Historically false.
In reality, it's false.
History. But
No,
it's
when you make a claim of history that it was put together 200-300 years later, this was a claim made by people before, like even scholars like John Wansborough. Yeah. A very proficient academic of the past, but he didn't have his disposal all these manuscripts and the tools to actually verify the datings of these manuscripts. We are now at a good position to actually carbon date some of the manuscripts.
That's a good point.
And verify that manuscripts now are within the 1st century
Okay, right.
of Islam.
Right, of Islam.
Yes.
Yeah, the 7th century.
So
right.
totally discrediting and debunking the claim that the Quran was put together 300 years later.
Not yet, because it's work in progress, I would imagine.
Listen, we have manuscripts, so many different manuscripts
Yes.
that have been carbon dated from the 1st century of Islam.
Right.
So it discredits any theories which
Where are
says
they?
the Quran.
Are they in the public domain? Can people see them?
Absolutely, they're in public domain. We have put up
Where are they?
in a website called IslamicAwareness.org. So between Islamic and awareness there's a hyphen. Islamic-awareness.org, and you will see the 1st century Quranic manuscripts, 2nd century Quranic manuscripts, 3rd century Quranic manuscripts, detailing where they are available, which library, which institution, which museum, or in private hands, how much it contains,
Is it any? But it's the same
who's
Quran.
dated them, which scholar has.
But it's the same Quran.
We're talking about the Quran of Muhammad
Yeah,
Sallallahu
it's the
Alaihi
same.
Wasallam. Of course,
It's no
of
change.
course.
There's no more revelations or less than
The
that. It's
Quran
same.
is the final revelation from God.
Yeah.
It's been sealed by the Prophet. That's it. No more additions and omissions to the Quran.
You want the mic?
That's
No, no.
Yeah. So, returning to the subject of the challenge of the Quran came with these linguistic constructs which totally baffled the Arabs at that time because they were not familiar with any of these linguistic constructs. So when it says produce something like it, how can they do it like it? Because it's something they cannot. Let me give you an example. You see the buildings that are around us. They're made up of bricks, cement, rods, right?
Yeah.
They're put together, joined together. Each brick is joined together, or stones joined together to form layers and then form walls.
Yeah.
Yeah? Let's understand something. So, if I were to ask you, can you make another building like it? Produce another building like it, you can't. My building is so unique. If you're an architect, you can say, what's so special about it? You can actually duplicate it. Yeah?
Yeah, you could.
But if I bring a building to you, a building made up of bricks, but each brick is not touching with each other. They're floating in space. Yeah?
Defying gravity, you're trying to say.
Yeah, they're not touching with each other. You can actually, put your hands through whatever, and you can clearly see they are totally floating from each other, and the whole building is constructed. And then I say, look, my building is unique. It is something that you cannot imitate. You cannot produce something like it. Now, you go ahead as an architect. Would you be able to do it?
Well, I don't think it would be possible for anybody to do that.
Exactly.
Because the building wouldn't exist. It would be a fantasy.
Because that building, it defies your knowledge of things, how you make a building.
Well, no, it would be a total fantasy. It would be written in some fantasy book because
No,
it would be impossible to do.
if I were to produce a building in front of you like
But
this,
you couldn't do that. No,
I'm making an argument.
I know this.
If I
but
did,
I'm
if I
making
did,
a counter argument.
no, let's understand something.
I'm reading a couple of a little bit ahead.
But you're not thinking. If I were to produce something like that,
Yes.
and I produced to you as a challenge that this building is made by God, right? Make something like it. You would not be able to because it is not within your capacity to make a building where the bricks are separate from each other in space.
Yes. That's
Yeah?
right.
So the Quranic claim, if you try to understand, because if you don't know linguistics, is Qur'an comes up with constructions of its chapters and verses, surah and ayat respectively, in a way that is synonymous to this kind of understanding where you cannot bring something like this in the Arabic language. That's why the Arabs at that time, they gave up and said it is impossible for a human being to produce something like it. That is why for 1439 years,
It's so difficult to understand.
human beings, Muslims or otherwise, when they looked at it, they say this is such Qur'an that we know from historically, you cannot produce something like of its nature.
And it might be a good thing.
It's not a good thing
It might be
only.
a good thing
This
because if it's-
demonstrates that the author of the Qur'an, without a shadow of doubt, objectively is God. That is what the Qur'an is trying to assert. That if it wasn't from God, you'd be able to do it. You'd be able to imitate it yourselves.
Yeah, but you've got a point there. But the point you made, or the example, was not a good one with the floating bricks, because that's an impossibility, and nobody can do that. Nobody can do that.
That's about the Qur'an. Nobody can do it. That's the precise analogy. Nobody can make the Qur'an, even though the Qur'an is there in Arabic letters.